even across the deepest ideological divides, to effect positive change. That's what we do best here at Convergence. That's what we're all about, bringing people of diverse perspectives together to chart a path forward. And our guests today they come from very different perspectives in this area, but they're exceedingly civil. So we're going to try to get them to bring a little heat to this conversation. Before I go any further, let me just say a few words about how this is going to work. I'm speaking with our guests here on Zoom, and all the viewers are watching live on the Convergence YouTube channel. If you have questions for our guests, feel free to put them into the chat function. You can also talk amongst yourselves. And we have folks monitoring that. They'll get some of those to me, so I'm hoping to weave them in naturally into the conversation that our guests are having. The topic of this conversation today is philanthropy and pluralism. We're going to investigate the promise of the sector to achieve meaningful change toward a more pluralistic future and the challenges to getting there. There's been a lot of great online commentary and opinion pieces about the topic lately, and I know that there are a lot of opinions in our fields right now, so I'm excited to talk about it today. And with that, I'm thrilled to introduce to you our guests for today's discussion, Kathleen Enright and Chris Stackrock. Kathleen is the CEO of the Council on Foundations. She's focused on making the philanthropic sector more vital and effective for more than 2 decades. Widely respected as a mission-driven leader and coalition builder, Kathleen joined the council as president and CEO in 2019. Since then, she's led the organization to establish a clear vision, offer a distinctive value proposition, and deepen member engagement. Prior to the council, Kathleen served as founding president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations and as a senior leader at BoardSource. Kathleen speaks and writes regularly on issues related to philanthropy. And Chris is a historian and a social entrepreneur working at the intersection of faith and public life. He's co-founder and director of Neighborly Faith, a nationwide movement bringing evangelical Christians and Muslims together on university campuses. Chris is also an advisor to PACE Founders, a DC-based philanthropic laboratory for civic engagement donor strategies. He's a senior fellow at Cardis, a pluralism think tank in Canada. Chris frequently publishes and advises philanthropy on strategies to advance pluralism. He holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and researches the non-Western roots of religious pluralism in the 21st century. I am so excited to hear from Chris and Kathleen today, so let's dive right in. So to begin with, what I'd like to do, there have been a number of opinion pieces stoking this debate over the past 6 months, most recently in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, some back and forth. But rather than quibble over the details of that, I'd like to get to some of the underlying questions that I think are at the root of this debate. What I'd like to know is whether there's a set of values that philanthropists need to be in general agreement about in order to advance pluralism. The question I have for you generally is, and I'd love for each of you to take this one at a time, what do you believe is philanthropy's responsibility to pluralism? What role should it play in moving this forward? Kathleen, why don't we start with you?
Perfect, Meg. Thanks for having me. And Chris, it's just been a joy to get to know you a little bit so far. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Well, so Meg, our entry point into this conversation is just a little bit different. So I wanted to start with that, which is, the council's purpose is to help philanthropy be trusted and effective partners in advancing the greater good. So to do that, philanthropists themselves and we as a sector as a whole need to work in ways that reinforce the building blocks of a strong, diverse democracy where everybody can participate and where everybody belongs. This is part of our charitable purpose, no matter what your specific mission is. So if that's your starting point, there are ways that we need to approach that. But right now, what we're seeing is a gradual weakening of democratic norms. And so we are in philanthropy reflecting and animating the tensions that are in our broader society. There's powerful forces at play that are not productive and will not help us achieve our charitable purposes. Things like groupthink and tribalism, the tendency to start to dehumanize people, or think in a way that is win-lose. So all of those things are barriers that stand in our way to be effective, to achieve what we want to achieve as philanthropists and more broadly as a sector.
Chris, why don't you tell us what your perspective is on this?
Yeah, I think philanthropy does have a unique position, but I think it might be a little different. That I would see that philanthropy should probably be the one that is innovative in this space. I think it wouldn't be ideal that philanthropy is the reason that Americans all get along. But as these problems with pluralism are coming down the road, as we're seeing them as maybe people in philanthropy, which are often looking down the road rather than being completely responsive to the situation today, as we're seeing these issues, I think philanthropy is uniquely tooled and positioned to come up, maybe incubate solutions to some of these big problems. And maybe the biggest problem we're seeing today is that philanthropy is right now not accepting that responsibility of being the bigger person in the room and saying, we see pluralism issues coming down the road. We need to retool for this, to be able to guide America, to create solutions that maybe one day ordinary people, schools, or maybe the government can fund. Because again, this is a really big problem. I don't think philanthropy can completely solve it, but I think philanthropy can uniquely look down the road and say, we need to retool for this. We need to be ready. We need to come up with solutions. And other people will catch on in other sectors of nonprofit government, education, churches, whatever. That's where I am at.
I couldn't agree more, Chris, that we need to be leading on this rather than following. When I think about the council's role and some of the previous leaders of the council, I've had occasion recently to reflect on one of my predecessors, Ambassador Jim Joseph, and he is so incredibly smart on this issue. For the longest time, he was telling us, I mean, he passed this year, so that's part of the reason I was looking into it. He always said to the council's membership that diversity need not divide, that pluralism, when you understand it in the right way and practice it in the right way, is a benefit, not a burden. And that when we're thinking about those outside the US, around the world, who have a hunger for democracy, it might actually be diversity in search of a more perfect union, is how he put it. And so I really appreciate that phraseology to think about diversity and pluralism and the connection to democracy. But none of that works unless we value each other as whole, complex humans, and that we really reject the tendency to dehumanize.
Kathleen, I don't go any further. I'm going to interrupt you both because I want to make sure we don't get hung up on the rhetoric here, which itself can be kind of polarizing. Over the last several weeks, I've heard arguments that pluralism is a word that belongs to the left and that pluralism is a word that belongs to the right. And first, let's just identify, like, what is it we want, forgetting about the words that we're using to describe it. What is this ideal future that we, rather than pluralism as a word, as a sort of Rorschach test for whatever it is we think either we're working towards or our political opponents are. So what is it that you feel that that philanthropy in particular should want for us as a society moving forward? Kathleen, you want to go?
You started me first. Okay, sure. Well, when I think about pluralism, which is not, again, the word that we use for the reasons that you just outlined there, Meg, it's a belief that when you have different types of folks in your society representing all sorts of values and beliefs and opinions and identities and cultural and religious touchstones, that is a strength. So we need to view it as a strength, and we need to make use of that strength in order to solve the most complex problems of our time. So nothing is going to advance in silos of ideologically homogenous folks. It will only advance when there's that wonderful blending of humans to move work forward. So when I think about what philanthropy needs to support, does support in many ways, it's at the individual level, we need to help create spaces and communities and a country, a world where people feel like they belong, and that the communities are socially cohesive, meaning we can work together to do hard things. So, I mean, that's very high level, but I think that that is part of the reason that we are the organizations we are charitable with purposes to advance the greater good.
Belonging and social cohesion. Chris, yes, thumbs up on those two things.
Yeah, similarly, I'd say maybe flourishing despite deep differences. It's kind of the same. And I would add to the fact that, you know, it is hindering, I'd say, America's potential if you don't have true diversity of maybe thought or just all kinds of diversity and maybe a space on a team in a neighborhood. But there's also a tax, I think, that maybe we're seeing partisanship bringing up, that now we have not only people pursuing their lives in different places, but also maybe competing with one another. You might have left-leaning, right-leaning nonprofits, left-leaning, right-leaning philanthropy saying, you know, we want to do this, we want to do that, same space. That competition, I think, is taxing. I don't think that's sort of a competition that's going to innovate, but rather draw down everyone's resources. So there's probably two sides in which pluralism is worth it. Even though it can still be fine to be like, okay, you know, we have people who are different and they're flourishing on their own. If they're not flourishing together and we have this partisan environment, they're also probably competing at some level, as maybe partisanship just keeps creeping into all kinds of new areas, like education, et cetera. So I'd say there's maybe a double tax going on of not pursuing pluralism.
That's the double tax is interesting. I'd love to come back to that. Chris, in a recent piece, you, to that point, you suggested that the incentives in the philanthropic sector are designed to reward more extreme views and ones that don't reflect that of most Americans. In fact, we're sort of more, citizens tend to be more aligned on things than our politicians are. In this way, I think you drew that parallel between politics and philanthropy.
That's it.
And I think the most generous interpretation of why that is simply because passions often drive charitable giving, of course. So, but there is that sort of natural inclination to move to polarities for organizations. So, what is it, with the understanding of that tension is probably something that will always that we can't eliminate completely. What is it? And this is a question that also I'm getting nudged by David Eisner at Convergence as well. Would love to know, what is philanthropy particularly well suited to do, given those tensions that it has to work with?
So given the stimulus, sort of that environment where you are rewarded for maybe a strong partisan stand, what is it tooled to do best?
Yeah.
I think it is really, if there are policy issues that maybe do benefit, I can't think of an example myself because I'm so used to throwing stones at this, but that maybe requires strong personality to make a strong stand, then I'm sure that there will be rewards reaped for sort of that courage. But right now, sort of when I even scroll on LinkedIn, everyone is trying to be a change the world, you know, Martin Luther, nail it on the door kind of person. And it sort of stands to wonder, if we're all doing this, who's making progress? Like, is it sort of just an all-out battle of ability? Whereas I think this level of, again, I'm going to go back to my soapbox, this level of competition has probably gone beyond the point of diminishing returns now, where we see like, okay, people are just competing. You know, you think this, they think that, you're not willing to compromise. You know, look at Congress. Are we going to get any better results? If we reward that kind of behavior or consider it to be a virtue, like maybe it's sort of an era has passed in which that is virtuous to do in sort of a democratic environment where 50% plus one, at least in theory, should prevail. But now it's sort of, I wonder if there's a moment where we need to turn back and say, we need to start clapping for the people who have courage to compromise on what they believe most deeply. We'll see. I don't know if people are willing to do that, but it could be a temperament change. People might not be exhausted enough. It does seem like Americans might be exhausted enough, at least in theory, to say, we want a bit more of that.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate how you're trying to move away from a zero-sum situation. And I think that's absolutely where we need to head. And, you know, philanthropy can look at its own history of support for social movements for a guide. You know, yes, there is a role for people who are raising the call for change and public will for change, of course. And then after the struggle, after that early work, you have to engage a broader, more diverse set of stakeholders if for the change to be enduring. So you look at civil rights, was Civil Rights Act in '64 was only passed because of a broad coalition that involved both political parties. And more recently, marriage equality, it succeeded because the philanthropic leaders behind that work and their nonprofit partners activated unlikely allies, grandparents, veterans, rural families, lots of folks who others in our communities would see as like them, and they were also allies. So, your point, it seems like there might be an overemphasis on that first part of a change process and less of an emphasis on institutionalization and governance and how this really becomes embedded in the core of society.
So
that is great.
But here's the tricky thing. When the rubber meets the road, Kathleen, this is a question for you, in your role, or really for any nonprofit organization that also has to appeal to donors to survive, to advance its cause. How do you inspire passion with a tone of moderate civility? And I mean, how do you sort of cut through the noise with something so measured and humane?
Well, first, you don't use the word civility. That is a word that folks are not on the same page about. Meg, I have a different perspective than you on this, because what I think is clear and true is that those foundations, those public charity grant makers who raise money and give money are farther out ahead on some of these issues about lowering the tensions, supporting more pluralistic decision making by the very nature of their work. They work with, let's take community foundations, right? They have donors who have a wide set of backgrounds, histories, worldviews, but they are there's a gap between them and the folks in the community who might be, informing the work or doing the work. And so as you're trying to build tables that bring those sets of stakeholders together and others, you're learning and you're figuring out where that common ground is, where you can work together. So I've seen community foundations they're masters of this kind of thing. Same in corporate philanthropy. So, if you're a publicly traded company, you think about your customers all day long, and your customers look like America. They look like, our pluralistic, diverse democracy. So you have to be attentive to the wide cross-section of humans that have a stake in your work.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here at Convergence on that. We heartily agree with that. But I have to ask, Chris, I would love to know, you mentioned, Kathleen, about some of the innovations and most forward-thinking ideas coming from some of the leaders in this field. There is also, Chris has articulated this, but he's certainly not the first or the last person to suggest that there is a kind of groupthink in parts of the philanthropic sector, and it can lean left for many. And one of the reasons for that is simply that a lot of this energy and scholarship comes from academia, and it comes from political movements, and it doesn't always come, especially when you're talking about addressing some of the places where political hate and violence are taking root in America. It is largely untethered from those regions of the country and cultures where it has sort of taken hold. So I'd love for Chris to expand a little bit on first of all, how you sort of diagnose this problem, and what you think where do you think we should start?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of my understanding of philanthropy, and as I see grants go out, it is very frictionless to give to a university or a think tank or a policy center. Some of these places that are really set up to be like, we are responsive to your needs in terms of like reporting, over accountability, I also think in philanthropy, I just kind of watch how eyes light up. People love press. They love, institutions, smart people. And it's fine. It's very human. I do think that like this challenge is very grassroots. It's very distributed. It's, challenging hate. Like that's not happening on an elite, Ivy League campus in a meaningful way. Or if it is, there's already resources there. So maybe a good example was that Biden summit, I think a year ago, where they said, we're going to target, hate after the shooting in Buffalo and maybe other examples. And we're going to, write a big check. And so, that's not really what happened, but something like that. But how will that money get to those places? It is a challenge. And I would say that philanthropy does have the opportunity to retool for more community-based organizations and maybe do some more influencer mapping on who has pull in these places. Often they are religious communities. Like what are the institutions that exist there and how do we best partner with them? It could be a staffing problem. A lot of nonprofits are staffed to reach out to universities. If you're reaching out to like a local pastor, a local synagogue, you're going to need a different person. A lot of like compounding challenges, but it is very possible. I'm just saying, that's a good start.
Great, thank you.
Connected to that, you're talking about the polarization and the politics that might also kind of bleed into some of our philanthropy. And one thing that I think we keep talking about community solutions and how it's happening in neighborhoods and in churches, and I think that really does hold a lot of potential for progress. Because the nationalization of both our politics and some of these problems isn't helping in some ways, because it is reinforcing and amplifying extremes that, as Chris pointed out in his piece, don't represent the most, the broadest cross section of our country.
One of we have a question from a viewer right now that I think is really interesting. We're talking about tensions as being an inherent obstacle, but is there a way to leverage some of these tensions that exist for the greater good to sort of amplify the work here? One of the things that comes to mind for me is not the tensions among average Americans, but rather maybe there's leverage to be had at the tensions between Americans and a sort of elite class, perhaps, or media who are working to kind of profit off of them. Or so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Can you reframe which
the question was, is there a way to use are tensions always bad among different groups in American society? Is there a way to use them to leverage this work of pluralism? And
Chris, I can start if you want, because this is right in the sweet spot of what the council is doing, wants to do. We want to recognize that courageous, constructive conflict is necessary to move important work forward. But when we're in toxic conflict, then that it doesn't help. So if you're trying to really understand the experience and perspectives of other folks who might be affected by the decision, especially those who've been least heard, then that is courageous, constructive conflict. If you're trying to transform that understanding of those various perspectives into collaboration on big solutions, then that is when it gets productive. And to be honest, it's actually really the only way that you can make progress on your specific mission, or win for your communities or the causes that you care about, even though I don't like the zero-sum frame.
That's
but
great.
In order to do that, I guess I'll just continue on. We're going to need new skills. So what's being modeled for us at the national stage is this toxic polarization and unproductive conflict. And so we need to change that page. We need to model a new way forward as and break that cycle, which I think that we can certainly do. And so it's things like, listening. It's listening very deeply. It's listening to understand. It's not listening to, make sure that you get your point in just next or ready for the debate. It's a new skill set about taking down the temperature on conversations so that people really know that they are heard without compromising your values. You still are holding your values. Your opinion may not actually be changed, but you might see the person across the table from you as the whole complex human that they are, with the opinion that they hold. So all of this is, just positive from an individual relationship building level, and will help decrease some of the toxic polarization.
I really like what Kathleen said. Oh, please.
Well, I was just going to, we've got a question from someone watching who was curious about what you both feel are sort of the most pressing divides in America today. And as I understand it, this is a question about what the diagnosis from different parts of the political landscape is for what we should be solving in America right now. I'm curious what both of you think. We're talking about toxic polarization. But there is a question of, there are real and tangible socioeconomic divides, racial divides, things like that. And then there are the more ideological ones, and they're obviously not discrete categories. They're sort of woven together in many ways. But when we're talking about these divides that need to be healed, how do you describe them? How would each of you explain what you think that we should be prioritizing? Chris?
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is more from my sphere in nonprofit work, but the problem we see is actually that Americans don't know each other across, and the divides might be religious or partisan. But as you might have heard of I think Stanford put out a big study on misperceptions of the other side of the aisle. The good news for America is that Americans most of the time can get along and have a good time. The bad news is that very few people are doing that across these divides that matter so much. It's really an exposure problem is the way I would see it. Maybe human contact theory might ring a bell. It is very expensive to make everyone go out and meet neighbors, but in a way, it's really the only solution. To sort of put everyone in rooms and give them seminars about the other is more expensive than people getting together and actually having a conversation. And the virtues we talk about, deep listening, et cetera, they are, I think, self-evident in those scenarios. It might sound like a heavy lift, what I'm describing, but that is the way we see this division is, it's not that people hate each other, it's that people don't know each other. If you do think that people hate each other, you actually sign up for an even more expensive philanthropic intervention, which is to say, how do you solve that? Yeah.
I think my answer is a variation on Chris's theme, but I'll say it this way, which is, we have normalized dehumanizing other people. We have normalized seeing people not as humans, but as abstract threats. And if you look at major conflicts around the world, dehumanization is the thing that precedes the next step in terms of war, what have you. And so in a way, dehumanization is the threat that we need to push back against. And I know that it comes from a place of pain. People have been wounded by the actions of others who are trying to move on something that matters to them deeply. So it comes from this place of pain. But we as a sector have to be able to break the cycle. We have to be able to find a new path forward.
So jumping off of that, it sounds like there's some general agreement around the idea that contact theory and exposure are have to be part of the solutions here. What role should philanthropic efforts, how do you recommend prioritizing local efforts and national efforts? What's the mix that needs to happen there? You both referenced local efforts as being particularly effective for this particular problem.
Well, I'll start from a place of, there are so many entry points and there are so many roles. And so anybody who wants to be in this work is needed, and the work that they would do would be important. But what I want to say is that the diversity of the ecosystem of philanthropy is part of its strength. So we do need, Chris, people to fund the think tanks and all of that too, right? But you're saying that there was an overemphasis in the past. So, I just I'll share a couple examples of how it's happening. There's the funder collaborative New Pluralists, and they are supporting a host of different grantee organizations that are doing different kinds of things, including, what you said, Chris, like contact theory, meaning having folks together, working on the opposite side of the helping immigrants feel as though they belong, meaning helping the communities welcome them, which is, a slightly different take. Community foundations across the country are experimenting and they're learning a lot. One of them, the Community Foundation in Berkshire Taconic, they give out grants that are specifically for groups across difference to come together, not necessarily to do anything, but to just start building those relationships. And so I think that's powerful, just giving the incentives to bring people together. And, some other groups like the Community Foundation of the Ozarks, they are organizing some of their work around the simple question, does everyone in our community feel as though they belong? And so if you're organizing around that question, then you start finding places and spaces, and these will be different groups in different communities who feel like they're on the outside. And then there will be a different kind of intervention that might help them feel more included. So I have a hard time answering, we don't want to prescribe to our members or to philanthropy writ large what they should do or what they should prioritize, but I will just encourage that there is a role, no matter your mission, no matter where you're located, there's a role for all foundations to have an impact on this work.
I think I'll come at this a different way.
I would love to know, Chris, if you could wave a wand and direct more money in a particular direction, I would love to know what you would suggest.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that we need more, this is a terrible word, but experimentation and innovation to find really affordable, scalable solutions around this, that community organizations, that sort of the places in society that get people together anyways, will find attractive in 5, 10, 15 years. I see the entire field as an outboard motor on a sailboat, pushing that boat out of the marina, looking for wind. I do think wind is coming, where you're not going to be writing checks to make Americans get along forever, but we do need to get something that works, that is affordable, that's cheaper than like study abroad, and more scalable than like something that, than study abroad. And I think a lot of that would be, New Pluralists is a fantastic example of saying, let's put money in all kinds of places. Let's measure the results. Let's message it to, the media upwards, so that there's this sort of chamber that is echoing back and forth. What's working, what's exciting. And then I think eventually some things will work and a lot of people will get excited and we're off. But right now, I think we are in this sort of like, we need to make the plane before it flies. There's another metaphor, sort of stage. Whereas I think a lot of people wish they were in the scaling the solution stage. Like, we know it works and now we just need money, money, money. It's so exciting. That is what I would direct money towards, is, how do we, finding ways to reach people. How do you get the most people in a room with a really impactful intervention per dollar? That kind of thinking, I think, will go a long way on this problem, where I think we don't know as much as we think.
We're getting a lot of questions that all are sort of in the general realm of like, so what should be funded? What are the tactics that organizations should be using? For the philanthropic groups to be using? I would like to know, Kathleen, do you feel like, are we on the precipice of a new way of thinking about philanthropy? Are you still making the case? Do you already see things changing? Like, where in that arc do you feel like your work is now?
Oh, I think we're very much in case making. I think that as with all innovation curves, there are some folks who are on the front end of the innovation curve, and we're pointing to some of them on this call. But I think philanthropy as a field, it's hard when you're supporting advocates who feel like they're losing ground, on a variety of issues. And there is a misconception that somehow supporting bridging divides or pluralism, or however you talk about it, is sort of a forcing to this mythical middle, or that you have to give up on your particular values. And none of that is true. That is not what this work is. It's actually surfacing shared values. It's finding ways in which goals align, which you can't do without deep conversation and conversation with the intent of understanding. I want to go back really quickly to what Chris was saying about places that we could support. And to be honest, our social sector is set up for this, right? And some of the cornerstone institutions that have been around for hundreds of years are great places for those easy interventions. I mean, going to build a habitat house together, joining up at the Y, being a volunteer for the Red Cross. These are huge, stable, important institutions for our society that can also and are also a force for good to take the temperature down on toxic polarization.
One of the subtexts of a lot of these conversations, and we've gotten some questions to this effect, often comes down to the notion that in the perceived zero sum of charitable giving, we're pitting dislocated, poor, often white Americans, rural perhaps, against more urban, racially diverse Americans, and that there's a notion that these needs are incompatible. This will be like an enduring challenge, obviously, in this work, I think. And I want to know how each of you, when we talk about belonging, how do you approach this question of competing needs or the perception of competing needs?
The thing that has struck me, and I think the op-ed was instructive too, is that it was sort of like a Rorschach test for what other what the person who's reading it brings into their reading. And I think that that's true with a lot of abstract terms, including pluralism and possibly also equity, where folks imbue them with their own meaning. And I think that when we don't speak clearly about what we actually mean, and we revert to these sort of high level concepts, it has I think it has increased division. I think it has separated us more than necessary. And so you're just pointing to one of those cases where I don't think folks who are working hard and doing so in a sophisticated way toward racial equity in any way want to or intend to do that in a way that hurts folks who are struggling in rural America who are white, right? There is a rising, making those kinds of policy changes that support racial equity will lift everybody who's struggling. So, but that, I don't think that is clear when you just say the sort of hashtag version of some of these efforts.
Indeed. Chris,
this is a bit of a different take. Oh, no,
go ahead, please.
With the zero sum way of seeing things, I trained to be a pastor, and sometimes it comes out. And I think when I sit in rooms and people feel really like bent out of shape because they feel like this tension, like the world, I can only, here's our budget, where do we put it? I almost think like sort of the pastor's response I can hear is like, do your best. If you have a particular calling to a particular place, then that is your calling. It is not a zero-sum world. Thankfully, we don't actually live in that world. And if you perceive it that way, maybe that's a personal or spiritual experience that you need to think through or read deeply on. That this is not, thankfully, the world where you can only do one thing. I think if you're a foundation that is doing this or that, like maybe there's something personal there too, a dislocation from reality. That the world is not such that you can only do one of those things. And if you feel the burden of doing them all, maybe you need to forgive yourself of that.
Chris, I would love to know if you, and obviously you don't need to be the spokesperson for all people of faith on this conversation, but if you, since you have a window into evangelical communities and pluralism, I'd love to know if you are sensing a change, a cultural change, and in either direction toward some of this. And if you think, what you think the primary barrier is, whether it's rhetorical or structural, to really bringing together more ideologically diverse groups that are all interested in this thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think right now is a very exciting time to be answering that question. 10 years ago, it was really hard for us to get evangelicals to care about this, about pluralism, about reaching out across differences. Today, like the way these faith communities work is they really focus on priorities. You know, an evangelical church will focus on breakdown in families. A more progressive church will have like a staff member in a department for a lot of interests. Right now, polarization has risen such that like we used to do trainings, we used to do so much work to get people to care. Right now, we just write checks because they're like so excited to do it. There has been a turning point where, and I think what you'll see too is when we measure evangelical civic engagement, volunteer hours, giving, it really measures high above the average American. And when they get onto something, they really go into it. And we're seeing that where like the level of devotion is amazing. And I think we'll see something pick up there, especially from the younger generation. There will be change that is noticeable. You might not read about it in the New York Times, but it's happening.
Well, and I can see why that would make so much sense. You know, your faith charges you to love, to love other people. And I think all of us probably have someone that we love that has profoundly different views than we hold. And we want to keep loving them. We want to stay in relationship with them. And so in service, we need to find a different way.
Yeah. And there's not that tension people perceive of like, oh, evangelicals, they don't like other people. They're very to themselves. I rarely have a conversation where people don't get it. It's just a matter of them saying, I already spend so many volunteer hours, dollars, devotion on things. Is it high enough on my list of priorities to do anything about it? And that has changed. We've rarely, like, I go to really conservative places and they'll always be like, we understand this. We think it's important. It's whether or not we're going to do something about it. So that has changed, and we're seeing really exciting results.
Well,
and is it your perception that enterprise projects that are like anti-polarization or pluralism, for a better lack of a better word, that are sort of born there, they just work better, they get more uptake, right? Is that your perception, Chris, rather than like having external entities come in to
Oh, that too. Sorry, I should mention that. Yeah, well, part of our success at SAID as an organization is that we are evangelical Christians. So when we go in to say, hey, let's do something, it's not bringing in foreign words, foreign ideas, especially in conservative faith communities all around the world. It has to be kind of grown there so that people recognize it and it doesn't look irreligious. It doesn't look like it's not their faith. And it really catches quicker and people really get it. If you frame pluralism or the activities associated with it in their language, and that took time. Like I would say even this is maybe a more of a career statement, but it was like, it took years of just trying before we got paid to push that thing along and like figure out the right words and the right networks. And that will happen in, I think, all these other spaces as well, where you just really have to spend a bit of time. But when it starts to make sense to people, when it has a bit of a track record in the community, they'll go, that's a great idea. We're going to do that. We're going to adopt that. We're going to get 500 people to do it this Saturday.
Well, and I would suggest that it doesn't have to be a separate standalone activity. It can be something that you're building into all the spaces where you normally convene. Where you are, you're trying to make sure that you aren't talking about some we that excludes, right? You're trying to make sure that your language is open enough for the broadest construct of who might be with you. And you're communicating in a way that is about meaning. I have to say about understanding meaning. I have to say that we have been really guided by and are learning a lot, and our internal capacity is being built in partnership with Resetting the Table, which also has religious roots that come out of the Jewish faith tradition. And they are helping us, the council team, and then we are working to support Philanthropy to just change the way that we set up some of the regular things that we're doing so that we aren't crowding out dissent, so that we aren't creating a sense of us, them, that is unintended.
Thank you, Kathleen. And it's a good point, because we work with, partner with Interfaith America on many things and have eyes into so many other faith cultures that are also doing their own work in this way. And it really, really isn't exclusive to anyone. It's really exciting. Yes. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit for the last piece of this, because it'd be remiss not to talk about, there's this whole other engine of toxic polarization. We sort of talk about the conflict entrepreneurs at Convergence, and I'm talking about different elements of mainstream and more marginal media, and then also the looming changes that AI may bring to exacerbate a sense of mistrust and misinformation. So how are you, Kathleen, I'd love to know how you're thinking about the future and how you interact with, in many ways, and I'm not talking about any particular media organization right now. I'm just sort of talking about the kind of energy behind the 24-hour news cycle in this moment, and also like a fraught moment for social media and AI changes. How do you feel you're going to need to interact with the conflict entrepreneurs that are that are out there in coming years? I mean, it feels like something that you can't ignore in your field.
No, absolutely not. And the good news is that many of our members are taking up this charge. You know, members like the Knight Foundation that has long supported media. You know, they are supporting more localized media outlets. You know, and pushing back against misinformation and all sorts of things along those lines. So luckily, in the broad ecosystem of philanthropy, there are folks who are taking up this charge as one of their key priorities. But I guess I would also say that in a lot of circumstances, the folks who are connected to a social media platform or a news outlet that is serving to divide or that is encouraging this kind of conflict entrepreneurs, you know, encouraging and rewarding, philanthropy can be a force for good there too. You know, one of the things that in corporate philanthropy, the more sophisticated corporate philanthropists are those that see that it's not the grant-making budget that has the biggest effect. It is their ability to influence and support change inside the broader corporation. So, you know, there's the Walmart Foundation and Walmart are a terrific example of this. You know, there are ways in which they change the supply chain, the supply chain to reinforce their commitment to climate. You know, it's not giving grants for climate; they do that too, but it's a powerful lever to pull. So there might be a corollary there for some of the social media and news organizations.
Well, that also brings up another interesting point, which is that, like, is the best way to bring Americans together to like have programs that are designed to bring Americans together, or is there a sort of process change that needs to happen and just become kind of part of a culture change in the other, you know, in environmental organizations and media organizations? And so maybe there's a kind of learning curve that needs to happen across nonprofits that are also interested in these things, if it is not their primary purpose. Yes, that's I mean, that's basically, you know, of course there's a space to bring people together to talk about this specific thing, but affecting a change in the way that we show up and what we incentivize and what we crowd out and do not allow, like the guardrails that we put around our conversations, and being
well prepared to do that. It's hard. It is hard when you're getting triggered by something, when you are like, that the thing that person just said feels like it denies my humanity. That is really hard to then say, hey, say more about that. I want to fully understand where you're coming from. And that also means that for some folks, this isn't their work. There's a woman named Loretta Ross. I think she was a MacArthur Genius Award recipient. And I just, she is so beautiful on this point. She says that if you're not healed enough yourself you can't engage in this kind of bridging work, and that is okay. That is okay. The folks who have been most harmed maybe don't need to be the first ones out of the gate in this culture shift.
I want to jump on the original question real quick about the entrepreneur. How do you phrase it? The entrepreneurs
Conflict
of disruption.
entrepreneurs.
Yes. To me, when I hear and see that, it's like this is a business model that is extremely good at what it's doing. I wouldn't compete directly with it, frankly. Like sometimes I see grants going out of like, we're gonna instead of this kind of fake news, we're gonna do this kind of, maybe it even be like real news or something, but maybe in a similar tactic, like we're gonna go one-to-one. To me, I'm not sure that could be successful simply because of how good you are. If you fight on their own grounds, I do think Americans will eventually tire of that. And who will be around holding another option when that moment comes? Maybe a better, higher road that has been walked for a few years. I think philanthropy could, in a way, model. We've been doing more collaborative work. We haven't gone, one head-to-head with this problem because we didn't want to constantly lose in some ways. But instead, we've modeled maybe an atmosphere of pluralism and building together. And it was small for a bit because I surf, you paddle after waves, you don't get them, but eventually the wave comes. And are you there? Are you paddling? And I think America will turn away from the toxic candy stuff eventually and start looking for like, who's doing the healthy, good stuff? That's always happened when I see religious revivals in history. It's the sort of like overnight successism of good things. I would hope that philanthropy is there doing really good, holistic, healing people, creating cultures in which that are almost a little maybe idealistic because no one else can afford to do that right now in their day-to-day lives. It's a bit of an idealistic statement, but I wonder if philanthropy could look at the landscape and say, what does it look like to actually get out of this scenario, not to win? And whatever winning means to you, it just makes me wonder, will you win against a business model that is so fantastic with your nonprofit giving? But you might be able to get everyone out of that scenario when they're ready.
Good plug for it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
What other sector really can take the high road without this bottom line?
Who can afford it? Even mom and pop givers, when they support things, it's no wonder they support things that are a little more like, I think philanthropy does have this ability to say, we're well educated, we see down the road, we do studies, and we see a path that gets us out of this scenario. And it's not one that's going to work in the next 3 years, but it is sort of maybe the high road. Mm-hmm. Just saying.
And it plays to philanthropy's strength, one of our strengths, which is that we're not subject to quarterly earnings reports or election cycles or those kinds of things. And we can take that very long view.
So we're going to close in a few minutes. I would love to know, for a final note, what is it that you feel like you need to do this work better and you don't have? And what I'm talking about is more than money. It's the question of we need to have more people with different views, perhaps, in our office, or we need to be able to work to pop into communities we've never visited and have them trust us. What do you feel like is the sort of code that you haven't quite cracked yet in how to do this work better? It's a very vulnerable question.
Yeah, it's not money, I'd say. I'd say right now would be I want to have more conversations with people that are maybe dissatisfied with the current model of how we're solving the culture war. That kind of look at it and go, I'm getting exhausted. I feel like I haven't moved an inch. I read and read and read and nothing happens. To me, that's the right conversation, and I love having that. I just don't have it very often. And to me, that's fuel for the work. It's like, okay, I feel like I'm not crazy out here. We can always, apply for more grants, et cetera. But that sort of core, you think of it, maybe I'd read your question as like, what is that like core energy spark? What fuels it? And to me, it's like finding people along the way that are like, yeah, we're going that direction too. You're not nuts. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Meg, I think some of what we need is more people who do want to abandon the win-lose zero-sum game and try to find a different path forward, to engage in conflict that's generative, conflict that maybe takes you to a different place than you originally thought, but it's still a positive place. And also, folks who are willing to compromise. One of the things that the council does is we're up on Capitol Hill all the time, looking for ways to expand philanthropy and policies that support the missions of our members and the communities that they serve. And nothing happens on the Hill without a coalition of folks who on a lot of things disagree. So they're not modeling the way on a lot of behaviors, including compromise. But the fact that compromise is now demonized is a problem, because that is very much zero-sum thinking.
Well, I'm so grateful to both of you for your time. I'm gonna wrap up this conversation now. This was really, really fruitful. I feel like there are a couple more hours to be had of this. So I hope that you'll stay in touch with us. To everybody watching, thank you for joining us today. Most of all, thank you to Kathleen Enright and Chris Stacharek. We're so grateful for your time and your insights. If you're here today, you're probably now on the Convergence mailing list. So keep your eye out for announcements on future Convergence live events. And you can always find us at convergencepolicy.org, where you can get involved, give, and learn more about our work. Thank you all, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
Thank you.